All right, so in this study, we've talked about the church, the falling away, the restoration. And so as we began, we simply had, this is some of the material that we're going to look at, but it involves the persecution. We'll talk about the fathers, that is, who are the church fathers and what do they have to say, and departures in doctrine, ecumenical councils, all those things. We'll talk about those as we proceed along the way, but it all involves departures from the faith, and that's how it's lined out. The last class that we talked about, or one of the last classes, was the three areas that we need to note regarding the New Testament. The New Testament gives us a pattern of doctrine. It gives us a pattern of government, that is how a local congregation is to be governed, and also gives us a pattern of worship. Isn't that interesting? We have the pattern of doctrine, government, and worship. And we know the word pattern is used on several occasions in the New Testament. 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 13, Paul says to hold the pattern of sound words, that is healthy teaching. And so also in Romans chapter 6 and verse 17, where we're to obey the pattern that was delivered unto you. So that's the word pattern, that's a mold. And so we have the pattern of doctrine, that is, how does one become a Christian? How does one remain a faithful Christian? The government of the church. I think it is interesting right here, if I might just add, that many people have despised the concept of a pattern. And by the way, why might they kick against the goad on that? And a lot of our brethren have hard time. Well, I don't think there's a pattern. Why would they do that? Well, that would be influence from not only the Catholic Church, but influence from the religious world. And what influence might that be? Humanism, secularism. And that, of course, gets right to it, to the definition of truth. Because if there's a pattern, then that shows us that there's a departure, and where departures lie. And people who want to depart, then they argue against the fact that there is a pattern to begin with. And so in the church, you'll hear it regarding, for example, worship. What about worship? Might people say, well, there's not a pattern of how to worship. Wherein might that take people? What do you suppose they're trying to justify here? Instrumental music, right, instrumental music. So the first thing you do, you talk about, well, here's the pattern of worship, and there's a pattern, and the pattern is singing, a cappella music, and they want instrumental music. It's not in the pattern, so what do? There's no pattern. There's no such thing. Well, if there's no pattern, there's no form, there's no standard, then we're left on our own to go in many different directions, not just on instrumental music, but in many other things. Yes, sir.
Churches have an order of worship, and that's an indirect proof of a pattern.
Yeah, it sure is, isn't it? So that was one class. And I would say if there's not a pattern of worship, how about government? Would it be all right to have a group of elders that are overseeing the churches of Wichita Falls and Wichita County and Clay County? No. If there's not a pattern, why not? Well, we're going to have to we have to think about, well, there must be a pattern. And so that's what we have regarding that first class. Then here's where we are. Next week, I'll show you real quickly. We're going to look about the propagation of Christianity, the miracles, the impact that miracles have, the nature of the gospel, the spread of Christianity. That's next week. But right now, I wanted to finish up regarding this particular segment pertaining to the study of this period in the early church. That would be the first 3 centuries. And why is it important to study it? And why do we need to see it? So the why question is answered pretty readily because of human nature. Human nature has never changed. It does not change. And what we find as the departures occur, so also we take lessons from it, because we can do the same thing, and perhaps maybe we do the same thing in the modern religious world. So what we read in history is really what we read now. And that's exactly what takes place, isn't it? So you can't find anything new under the sun, can you? And that's exactly how Solomon put it. So human nature has not changed, and what we saw then occurs now, especially since paganism has had such a major impact and increasing in our world today. Paganism opposing Christianity, and you're seeing it right now as things are kind of beginning to unwind in America. So that's one thing. So on the left-hand column, we looked at it last time that we had class. And you probably say, well, I don't remember that because I don't hardly either because it was about a month ago. But at any rate, so I won't do anything but just briefly go over it. And that is, the state of the Roman world was such that there was, number one, there was no objective truth. There was no such thing as an objective truth to which people must agree, and they must understand, and they must obey. In the New Testament, you find it, for example, right there in Pilate's interview with our Lord Jesus Christ. What did Pilate say that shows us he doesn't believe in objective truth? What is truth? Jesus said, I've come to bear witness of the truth. Everyone that is of the truth hears my voice. Pilate said skeptically, well, what is truth? Say, yeah, sound familiar, doesn't it? What is truth? That was really the Roman world at that time. That's how they all perceived it to be. Truth is what you think it is, and it doesn't matter. There's no objective. By saying no objective truth, objective means there is a truth that stands regardless of what men may say about it. And there is a truth, and that's exactly what the Bible shows us. As a matter of fact, the example that I like to use is when Galilei, remember what his discovery was? What was his big discovery? That's right, the earth revolves around the sun. So he published those findings, and who took him to task? Catholic Church says, no, that's not true. No, as a matter of fact, the earth is the center of the solar system. Now that was science. See, that was the science behind the vaccinations back then. I again opened another can of worms right there, didn't I? But that was the science then. That was science. No, science says that the earth is the center of the solar system. So it wasn't just a disagreement. They said, no, you're going to recant, or you're going to be punished. You can't put those things out. You're going to be blocked off of Facebook. You're going to be taken off of Twitter. You're going to be taken off all those things. Galileo said, I don't want to be taken off Twitter. So they were going to put him in the tower. So Galileo was taken to trial. What happened? So he recanted. He said, okay, it was pressure. It was pressure. And it was political persecuting pressure. And he said, okay, I was wrong. As he's walking out, he tells some of those that were with him, he says, well, the earth does move for all of that. And I know it does. He discovered it. So later on, we discovered it was all correct. Everything was correct. Same thing regarding when Columbus went to the kings of Spain, king and queen of Spain, and said, I want money to go to discover the world. Actually, he was going to go find a route to India. And what happened? Well, they gave him money. And he came over, but at first the scholars that were in the seminaries and the scholars that were in the university says, no. Because you're asserting that the earth is spherical. It's a sphere. And that can't be. And so here's what a couple of the scholars got up. I put a bulletin article on this several years ago, and it's kind of interesting. One of the scholars stood up and said, well, you know what? If the earth is spherical, as Columbus says it is, and there are people living on the bottom side of the earth, that'd be like flies on the ceiling. So, they got to walk around with little sticky feet. I was like, no, this was the university crowd. And another one would say something similar, says, well, okay, how do they not fall off? Why is that? How does that happen? See, but that was science of those days. And so the point I'm making is, there is an objective truth. It was spherical. No matter if the entire world denied it, it was still true. The same thing regarding Jesus Christ and the Bible's inspiration. People may deny it, and the Jews may all deny it, and people may deny truths today, but it doesn't make it any less true. It's objective. It doesn't make any difference as to what you think about it. That's objective truth. Well, the Roman world had no objective truth. So also regarding no holiness, their gods were just as unholy as they were. And so they practiced debauchery and wickedness, fornication, and it was very common practice. So all of that kind of set the stage for what we needed in Christianity, what man really needs. Not only so, but the maintenance of a state religion. The religion of the Roman world was a state religion. It was fostered by the state. It was supported by the state. So consequently, when you have, I think Brother John mentioned this in the last class, we have Pliny the Younger, who is a governor, I think in Bithynia, isn't that correct? In Bithynia, which is in Asia Minor. And he has these Christians who are not doing obeisance to the emperor and the idols that the emperor had and the statues. You know, all they wanted them to do is take a pinch of incense and kiss the toe of that statue or whatever, and show that they're going to be obeisant, compliant with the emperor worship. And they said, no, we're not going to do it. So Pliny writes to the Roman emperor, said, Trajan, he said, what are we going to do about this? How do we handle this? Because it was a state religion. So the difficulty they had figuring that all out shows us, because it was not simply, okay, this is what you believe, and it has nothing to do with how we manage the state. So a state religion had meant superstition in it. We can talk about that for a long time. Spiritual knowledge was only for a few. That would be an esoteric religion. That would be just a few people. This is what Gnosticism became in the 2nd and 3rd century. Just a few people, just the enlightened ones. They're the ones who have the special insight into realities of the world, and the rest of us, that's just too bad. So this is the state of the religious world at the time. Pantheism, of course, many gods, as well as the various philosophies. So I want you to think about how different it was simply with Judaism, that is, and I'm going to qualify it by saying Old Testament Judaism. And what happened here? Well, there's only one God. Well, that is not just, okay, that's your belief. That was earth-shattering to the Roman state. There's only one God. And so because there's only one God, we're not going to do obedience to these other gods. We're not going to act like that the Caesars are deified. No. That was something that the Jewish people refused to do, and the Roman government allowed them to live this way for quite a while. They allowed them to live that way in the land of Palestine, Judea, Galilee, so forth. So they allowed that to take place, but that was really an irksome point with them. And Christians, of course, are going to say the same thing. And it will show us how the persecutions really got rolling. So also, we have a revelation that was given by God to man and kept vouchsafed to the Jewish nation. I want you to think about how significant and important it was for one nation. God selected a people to keep his revelation. Someone asked me this not long ago. I don't remember who it was. And they said, well, why didn't God just give revelations or revelatory material to different peoples in different places? Why would that not have worked? Why do you suppose that would not have worked? Instead, he chose a nation. He crafted it, the Jewish state in the Old Testament. They were together. They were melded together in captivity, and he gave them revelations, and they were together, and they kept the revelations that God gave them, the canon of the Bible, together. What would have happened if God had said, well, I'll give some of it to the Chinese, and I'll give some of it over here to the people in India, I'll give some of it to Rome, and some of it to Spain? What would have happened? Confusion on the face of the deep. There would be but not only confusion, there would be no collection of God's revelation by which the Old Testament. You could never see that. You could never be able to make that discernment. So it was necessary that there would be one nation given the revelatory material, and that's what happened. That's what the Old Testament is. It's revelation from God. So that's completely different than what you have in Rome, in the Roman world. The Roman people had their own personal gods. Every family had its own god. You know, Julius Caesar had his goddess was Venus. Other ones had Mars. It is just on and on and on it goes. And they all had their different gods of their family. And so that's completely different. So that was an irksome point to the Roman world as well. Here's something else I think very interesting. And you might just turn in your Bibles here to notice this one. This is letter D. or rather letter C and D, religious knowledge kind of fits into what I've just said, but let's look at D specifically. There's a clear distinction and clear definition of what it is to be holy. And this is 1 Peter chapter 2. So look at it for just a moment. And this is something that you have throughout the New Testament. It just continues as one line throughout the entire New Testament. So this is we'll start at verse 1 here. Putting away, therefore, all wickedness, all guile, hypocrisies, envies, evil speakings, as newborn babes long for the spiritual milk which is without guile, that you might grow thereby to salvation. If you have tasted that the Lord is gracious, unto whom coming a living stone, rejected indeed of men, but with God elect and precious, you also as living stones are built up a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. And then we have the same thing in verses 9 and following. You are an elect race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession, that you might show forth the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light, who in time past were no people, but now are the people of God. Now this passage, of course, has much to say about who are the people of God today. But the emphasis really that Peter's making is what? Holy, godly living. And we can find that over and over again in the New Testament. And here's something that might be worth noting. And that is, if these men that wrote the New Testament were uninspired, would they have written such things as we just read? No. Why? Because men uninspired write things to justify themselves. Muhammad writes the Quran to justify the killing and justifies it in the Quran. Joe Smith writes justification for his wars and for further supposed revelation in the Book of Mormon. And he tries to justify what he's doing. Muhammad justifies what he's doing. Interestingly, no New Testament writer justified what they did. They were actually setting the standard to which they themselves had fallen short upon several occasions, didn't they? Didn't Peter himself fall short? He did. Paul tells us about it in Galatians chapter 2. And this is continually throughout the New Testament. So they set the standard, and it shows us, kind of a roundabout way, the inspiration of the text. But this is completely different, and the point I'm making, it is completely different, and it makes a different people than was common in the Roman world. And it set them apart simply by the way that they lived. The way that they conducted their lives was different than what we have in the Roman world. So let's think about that in practical application. What does that mean for us? I think the answer is pretty obvious, isn't it? What does it mean? If we're not living differently than what's going on out here, maybe we better take a rethink about how we're living and how whether we're living godly and holy lives or not. If we're not living any differently than what they do out here, and if people can't see that there's a difference, the way you talk, the way you walk, what you count as important, worshiping God, gathering together such as this on a Sunday morning, people can't see there's a difference in the way they live and the way you live. Where's the problem? Well, let me see where the problem lies. I'll have some more to say about that in the sermon period in just a few moments. But there's a difference, a major difference with a major distinction between the way Christians live and should live in the first centuries and the way the Romans lived. And there should be and the way we're becoming now, like the Roman world, there better be a big difference in the way we live and the way people live. Any thoughts, any comments? Don't want to drive it with all my own voice here. Okay, well, letter E is clear objective truth. We've talked about that. There's clear objective truth. So what passage might come to your mind thinking about there's a clear objective truth? And objective means, what does objective mean? John 8:32 is one I think of. What do I mean by objective?
Continue with my doctrine.
What do I mean by objective?
different from subjective.
That's true. What would let's start with subjective. What does subjective mean? Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. That's right. Opposite of subjective. Subjective means what I think is right. Now, do we hear people in Christianity, so-called, say that? Sure. Well, whatever you think is right is right. Well, if you think it's wrong, well, it's wrong. It doesn't matter. It's just what you. So what becomes the standard is what I think. That's not objective truth. That's subjective. It's subjective to what I think. Objective truth means it's disassociated from what I think. It has nothing to do with what I think. And that's what we think about when we talk about objective truth. So the passage that Bruce mentioned is where's that one found? John 8:32. You shall know the truth. Look at this passage. You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. I want you to think about how or what truths you find right there in that text. So number one, you shall know the truth. Number one, it's possible to know the truth. Have you ever heard people say you can't know the truth? Yeah. I've heard people in the church and pulpit say you can't really know the truth. Can't understand it. That's because they don't read it. You know, I had a professor at Harding University, Jimmy Allen. He would say, people come to him and say, well, I don't understand the Bible. It's confusing. He said, what passage is it that you're having trouble with? Well, it's just confusion. They don't have a passage in mind. He said, well, that's right. The problem is you're not reading. What passage is it? That's not to say every passage is very simple, but the idea that people just take from one another, well, it's confusing, I don't understand it, because they're not reading. They're not studying.
I know before I actually learned how to dig into it, basically, it's not like picking up a novel and reading it. It jumps around, and you have to.
Yeah.
That's because God gave you intelligence, and He did not make it so hard you can't understand it. But they just give up, and they're like, no, because they're looking at the whole picture instead of taking it.
You know, I'll say this, and this is, you might rankle you a little, not you, but people. So James Harding, he was the one for whom Harding College was named, as well as David Lipscomb, people like that. They were good friends, and several of them back then, and Jacob Creeth, who was a preacher in the 1830s and 40s, Jacob Creeth, they bragged, I've never read a novel in my life. I've never read it. I don't read fiction. I don't have time for fiction. That's what they said. But not to say that I haven't. I've read a few Louis L'Amours, that kind of thing, as you have too, probably, or whatever. And we kind of do, but I think it's funny, but you're right. But the novel, okay, because it's not like novel reading. It's not like, okay, that's right.
So now you don't have to have any effort there except to stay away.
That's right. Yeah. And that's the challenge. Yeah. So in John 8, we have number one, you shall know the truth. That means that it's possible to know the truth. Not only that, number two, there are some people who are going to know it. You shall know the truth. That is, it's not only possible, but some people are going to do it. You shall know the truth. That's a prediction. And then what does the truth do for you? According to John 8:32, you're looking at the text. What does it do for you? Set you free from sin. So the Jewish reaction was what? We have never been in bondage to any man. How do you mean? What do you mean we shall be free? And then he says, everyone that commits sin is a bondservant. You're a slave to sin if you commit sin. It sets you free from sin, and it's a knowledge of the truth. So this is a completely different message than was common in the Roman world. And you can imagine. So not only that, but the center of it, of course, was what? The Messiah of the Old Testament. That was the center of Old Testament prophecy, the center of Old Testament prediction. It is sad, and I'll mention this in the sermon here in a few moments, but just because what's happening now in the world, we see so much mistaken concepts on Facebook, but basically that's a Jewish system. And the Jewish system says, no. What did the Jews say regarding the Messiah? What did the Jews do with the Messiah?
Killed him
Murdered him. Murdered him. Why?
because they didn't believe.
Protect their own religion. What was their religion? The Old Testament, Jesus said, you search the Scriptures because you think that in them you have eternal life. These are they that testify of me, John 5, 20, 45, and so forth. Why didn't they accept him?
Because they misinterpreted it so much.
That's right. They misinterpreted it. How did they interpret it? Interpret it to say what? What did they come out with? What kind of Messiah were they looking for? Earthly empire. Earthly king, earthly empire. Someone to free them from Roman yoke. And he would sit in Jerusalem, in Palestine, sit on the chair of David, and he would rule over a kingdom. That is a system of infidelity. It caused them to murder the Messiah. What is being taught today on every hand? Same doctrine in these churches all around us. System of infidelity. It's infidelity, unbelief, to say that Christ is coming back to sit on the throne of David in Jerusalem and Palestine. That's the very doctrine that caused them to kill him. Because he preached a doctrine they did not want to believe, and it taught them a kingdom they did not want to accept. So the Messiah, however, was the center of Old Testament prophecy, and Jesus fulfilled, and it's important to note this, fulfilled the prophecies of the Old Testament. Fulfilled them, filled them full. And it was not a mistake in the plan of God to give us the church. This was what God had intended from the beginning. Ephesians chapter 3, verses 8 to 11. So it's important, I kind of drive a peg down hard here, because it is the doctrine, this is the same doctrine that is taught so frequently around us, and it's easy for us to kind of get this and let it infiltrate into us and think about it in the same terms as we have going on in the Baptist church, the Methodist church, the Pentecostal church, so forth. It's the same thing. But that's the very doctrine that murdered the Messiah. All right, any thoughts on that? Okay, so you shall know the truth shall make you free. And so there's an objective truth, people will know it, and it would set them free. And part of that was, of course, the Messiah, the center of Old Testament prophecy, John chapter 5, 45 to 47. He tells them, you search the Scriptures. And he says, because you think that in them you have eternal life, and these are they that testify of me. Isn't that interesting? Here's another text. I want you to look at this one from Acts chapter 13, thinking about the Messiah. Acts 13. This is Paul in Antioch of Pisidia. Now, where's Pisidia, by the way? Where is Pisidia? Turkey, middle of Turkey. And it was a Roman province in the middle of that country. Paul and Barnabas, this is the first journey, come here to preach. Paul stands up. They say, okay, do you have anything to say? Paul stands up and preaches, and here's what he says, part of his sermon. He brings it to Christ, verse 23, and he tells us this. Of this man's seed, everybody follow that one? Acts 13:23. Of this man's seed has God, that is, speaking of David there, according to promise, brought unto Israel a Savior, Jesus. When John had first preached before his coming the baptism of repentance to all the people of Israel, and as John was fulfilling his course, he said, what suppose ye that I am? I am not he, but there comes one after me, the shoes of whose feet I'm not worthy to unloose. Now here's Paul's direct address. Brethren, children of the stock of Abraham, those among you that fear God, that would be God-fearers, Gentiles in the synagogue also. To us, that's important, to us is the word of the salvation gone forth. For they that dwell in Jerusalem and the rulers, because they knew him not, nor the voices of the prophets which are read every Sabbath day, fulfilled them in condemning him. And though they found no cause of death in him, yet asked they of Pilate that he should be slain. And when they had fulfilled all things that are written of him, they took him down from the tree and laid him in a tomb. All right? What did Paul say regarding the fulfillment of Old Testament prophets? This is it. And what did he say about them understanding, being able to understand the Old Testament? What did he say about that?
They fulfilled them, but they fulfilled them by condemning.
Yeah.
Fulfilled the bad side of the prophecy.
Not only that, but he implies something else here too. He says the scriptures are read. How often are they read? Every Sabbath day. So, brethren, children of the stock of Abraham, those among you that fear God, to us is the word of the salvation gone forth. For they that dwell in Jerusalem and the rulers, because they knew him not. They didn't know the voices of the prophets which are read every Sabbath. How can you read the Bible every Sabbath day and not understand what the voices of the prophets actually say? How can that be? Preconceived ideas, prejudices, here's how it's going to be, and so they put blinders on. That's exactly what's happening right now in the religious world. They read them every Sabbath, and they didn't understand them. That is a warning to all of us, isn't it? Be very careful, and let's not draw conclusions that are not warranted by the evidence. So that's how it was going on regarding the Jewish people of the Old Testament. So then they had false teachers. Here's one that we want to notice. The Jews did have false teachers among them. And one was named Judas of Gamala, and he is mentioned in Acts chapter 5. So let's go to Acts 5 for a moment. This is an interesting episode right here. I'm simply trying to sketch what's going on with Judaism at the time to give us a sense of the Roman world, and we'll find out how this all plays a part as we move into the apostasy period. So this is Acts 5 and so it starts in verse 33. Who's doing the speaking according to verse 33 and 34? Now the apostles are taken to trial. And so finally, one Pharisee named Gamaliel stands up, doctor of the law, had an honor among the people, and commanded to put them out for a little while. Take these apostles, put them outside. Okay, here's what he said. And he tells them, he says, look, there have been many different movements and insurrections that have arisen among the people. He says, here's one of them in verse 36. There was a man by the name of Theudas, giving himself out to be someone. He said about 400 men joined him. But what happened? It dispersed and came to nothing. Verse 37, after this man rose up Judas of Galilee, or Gamala is called, Judas of Galilee, and he drew away some of the people after him. He also perished, and all, as many as obeyed him, were scattered abroad. So what do you think his advice is going to be? These are the movements, the insurrections that occurred in the past. Regarding the apostles who are out here in this room waiting for our decision in the Sanhedrin, what do you think his advice is going to be? Well, Gamaliel is giving them advice to do what now? Well, stop following people.
They'll be here for a bit and then.
Right. He said, look, that's right. You don't have to go persecuting them. Just let it alone, and it'll die on its own accord. It'll run out of gas. It'll die on the vine. That's what happened with Judas. That's what happened with Judas of Galilee. So they had a lot of false teachers, but why were their false teachers able to garner so many people following them? Because they had all these earthly, messianic ideas about the kingdom. And so they were able to garner all these followers, and they caused insurrections. And he said, this is Gamaliel speaking to the Sanhedrin, the apostles are the same way, just don't worry about them, and it's going to go away. Don't worry about persecuting them. Well, as you know, the Sanhedrin couldn't stand that. Someone told me this the other day. You can assess this for what it's worth from the What It's Worth department. When I was on this Holy Land tour, or the Mediterranean cruise, and we went to all the places where Paul had preached, a lot of them, and someone said, well, they had a cruise or an excursion director who was a Jewish person, and said, well, the reason that Christians were persecuted by the Jews is because Christians tried to cram it down their throat. So, and so if they didn't try to cram it down their throat, they would have left them alone. I tell you, that is, Yeah, that's so far off base. No one's trying to cram anything down anybody's throat. It's just simply preaching the truth. I'll tell you what people trying to cram down throat is what's going on with Islam right now. That's what's going on. That's called cramming down your throat. But the apostle simply preached, went to the synagogue, said, here's the Messiah. But Gamaliel said, I think this will die out very soon if you just leave it alone. So real quickly, noticing what are the schools and sects of Judaism? Real quickly. There are three main schools, sects of Judaism. They were the what? Pharisees, Sadducees, what's the other one? Essenes. Essenes are not mentioned in the Bible, but they are mentioned in secular writing. We know them from Philo of Alexandria, a Jewish writer, and he tells us in that time about the Essenes, and that's what the Dead Sea Scrolls are all kept by the Essene people. So these are the three main sects of the Jews, and that would be the different schools of thought. And they had fightings among themselves, and Paul's going to utilize some of that argumentation between themselves in Acts chapter 23. And we'll see how that goes when we look at some more in Acts, which I plan to do some travels of Paul after this special series is concluded. So, all right. All right, any questions, any thoughts about it? Yes, sir. Right. All of them filled with false teaching. Yeah. Well, the point of all of it is, this is the general view of religion and what's going on right then at that time. And so the Jewish people, the ones who should have been prepared for the Messiah, who should have accepted him immediately, would be the Jewish people. And sadly, that did not occur, but that was, of course, what prophecy had predicted, wasn't it? All right, so next week, what we'll do, and you can think about this in advance, is why was Christianity so successful in that kind of context? Why was that so successful? And I'm going to point out the miracles, the nature of the gospel, really what the nature of the gospel is, and how that Christianity spread. And then we'll be set up for the persecuting powers that came on. All right, any more thoughts? I'll let you have the final word. Okay, thank you for your participation.